Thank you, Megan, and thanks everybody for joining today. I'm really excited to talk to you about four trends that we've seen throughout the pandemic that have been definitely accelerated by the pandemic and that we think are here to stay. I think you're going to hear me say the word accelerated a lot, as many of these have been ideas or concepts that started pre-pandemic but have increased with the pressure added from having a global pandemic. So today we'll talk through four trends VectorVMS and our sister brands are seeing in the space and believe will continue to exist and how to manage to them. So before I dive into those trends, I just want to take a quick second to talk about who VectorVMS is. We provide vendor management services and solutions to manage the life cycle of non-employee labor. So that can be anybody that's your contract workers, contingent workers, anyone within the gig economy, independent contractors, or any project-based work. We've been in the space for about 20 years, having a super configurable technology. And we also have a state-of-the-art hybrid program management team that allows you to determine what parts of your contingent workforce program you want to manage and what you want to outsource. So working for an organization that specializes in contingent labor and then working closely with our sister companies that manage full-time labor, it gives us great insight into trends that are impacting the total workforce. And the first trend I want to talk about today is employee-led organizations. So I wanted to start with this one just because I feel like it is the one that we are feeling the most. It's the most impactful. I think everywhere you look, people are looking to hire. There's perceived labor shortages. I think I personally hear the words great resignation at least once a week, if not daily. So I wanted to start here and kind of talk about where we see labor shortages, kind of get into that discussion. And I do want to say this is again where I feel like we were talking about this pre-pandemic, but it's definitely become more prevalent and more front of mind as the pandemic has gone on. The first thing I want to talk about it is from a historical lens. I think we've all seen kind of the white papers or the webinars or the discussions pre-pandemic about the reasons that we're having the quote unquote war on talent. Pre-pandemic, we talked about these things being attributed to record unemployment. We were seeing the baby boomer generation leave the workforce in droves, as well as one generation was leaving the workforce, we saw a new generation entering the workforce where there was a mismatch between the skills that were becoming available or the jobs becoming available and the skills of the generation entering the workforce, as well as things like decreased accessibility to H-1B visas or removing things like premium processing for those H-1B visas, slowing the overall time to fill roles. So we take these factors that existed before the pandemic, couple them with factors that are introduced, and we have a whole perceived idea of labor shortages. So I want to start with where we are now and have that current discussion of how things have become even more accelerated with the current conditions. So other reasons we're seeing shortages in labor, global pandemic has forced us to have a lot of self-evaluation. One example of this is Indeed did a survey over 1,000 different employees that actually voluntarily left their roles during the last 2 years to understand why. And 92% of them said that they just were not passionate about the job that they were currently doing. So it really made people look internally and evaluate where they are currently with their lives because the exact quote was, "Life was too short to do something that I'm not passionate about." So there was that idea of kind of looking at and determining what you want to do next. And that has downstream impact to the people that are at the organization existing today. Because now that the people that are still there that remain have to kind of pick up the workload, creates burnout, it's cyclical and kind of people moving out of the positions. Another reason we're seeing shortages is those that were laid off during the pandemic are not necessarily re-entering the workforce. And that's for a variety of different reasons. So one of them is parents not re-entering the workforce. When they looked at why this might be, one of the things that Glassdoor found is that the daycare and the childcare is actually one of the slower industries to rebound from the global pandemic. So even those that are willing to come back to work are looking to come back to work might not have that luxury because there isn't that spot that was previously available for daycare or childcare to them. And then also reevaluating priorities or looking at the structure of how people are looking at their lives. Some people just don't want to return back to the workforce and are taking that role on more permanently, and they were not doing that previously. The next thing to look at is immigration from a different sense. With the pandemic restrictions, there has been decreased immigration, and Cato Institute accounts that for 1.2 million of the open jobs. Another thing to look at was for reasons people aren't coming back that were previously in the workforce is a record number of people looking to work for themselves, whether that was voluntary for wanting to do more from an entrepreneur basis, or if it was less voluntary and was adding a different type of role during the pandemic. There are just a lot of more people that are working for themselves or in that arrangement today. I mentioned the retirement of the baby boomer generation. The pandemic actually sped this up. I don't think that's really a surprise to anybody. It kind of forced earlier retirement. According to Goldman Sachs, of the 5 million gap in the workforce of open positions, 2.5 million of that is the baby boomers that have left the workforce during that 2-year time frame, and over half of those workers actually retired early. And one of the last reasons I want to talk about for the labor shortages is when automation is not introduced correctly. I work in technology, so this was a surprising thing for me to learn. But essentially what they're finding is a lot of automation was added during the pandemic, but if it was added incorrectly, it's actually filtering out qualified candidates. So something that's super important to think about when adding automation is keeping that human component so that there's not a kind of black and white metric between qualified and unqualified, and you're really looking at the gray areas. So really using automation to start and then coupling it with the human touch to make sure you're not missing a large segment of the workforce. So that kind of takes us through what and why there's labor shortages. We talked about the historical aspect of it and the current items that were accelerated by the pandemic. But at the end of the day, we all have positions to fill. So how are we going to do that? So kind of looking across our Vector, our sister companies, our clients and partners, we kind of looked at different strategies that have been implemented to kind of fill those hard to fill positions. One of the first strategies that I want to talk about is talent pooling and pipelining for pressing positions. We see that being adopted more and more, especially across our clients, looking at like commonly recruited positions, high volume positions. If you have any kind of seasonal based work, kind of getting that pipeline and that pool started ahead of time to decrease the time to fill when you actually need that worker to be on site. There's a variety of different ways to do this, to build these pools of talents. The first is through proactive marketing campaigns, setting up an area where candidates can apply, knowing that there might not be a position today, but you consistently fill for this position and can reach out to them when that position is available. So you're starting with a group of talent rather than starting from scratch. Filling this with alumni talent. So you do have those workers that maybe retired early or haven't returned to the workforce yet, or workers that left your organization but on good terms. We've seen people implement alumni talent pools so that they can send out current jobs, especially contract jobs, to people that have worked there previously. And again, we're high performers, knowing that they're going to onboard quickly, knowing the culture of the organization, as well as they know that they've done that job in the past. Silver medalists or runner-up candidates. So you've done all this time, you've vetted all this talent, you know this person is a good fit. There might have just been someone slightly better. Putting that person into your talent pool so that you have a place to start from when that role becomes available again, as well as considering high-performant contingent talent, looking at people that have worked for you on a contract basis in the past and seeing if they're willing to come back for a full-time position. So this essentially just gives you a better starting point to decrease the time it takes to fill those positions. But it is important, as I said, to keep that tech component and then the human component of the curation to make sure that you don't have a stagnant talent pool of talent that's kind of moved on to a different point in their career. Another area that we're seeing a lot of implementation are referral programs. I think this is a huge opportunity, if that's not something you're doing today, to add a referral program into your organization, not only for your full-time talent, but your contingent talent as well. And then when a worker, I think we all know referred talent is a great source, and is backed by the fact that they tend to stay 70% longer if the talent is referred versus going through and having no kind of affiliation or connection to the organization. There's various different ways you can construct these. You can have just a flat rate. We've seen where people have different tiers based off of how hard the job is to fill. And one interesting thing I found that one of our partners is doing is they do kind of, for the higher volume, higher turnover positions, is having a kind of variable rate structure, so that if the referred employee and the referring employee are working at the same time, they actually receive more or higher compensation variably on their salary or their hourly rate, so that it kind of incentivizes them to stay in the program together, so that they both benefit mutually. The next thing to look at is market rate analysis. I think we've all seen it where the compensation is a huge reason why people are leaving positions. I think it's a great time to really look at what your rates are compared to the market. So understanding what people are paying in your area for the different skill levels within a position, as well as what they're paying in that location. So you have in your back pocket what that rate is in your market. And you can look at, once you have that information, do you kind of want to match or kind of lead in that space of what you're paying compared to the market? But at least you have an understanding of what that going rate is. Internal investment. So putting the time in to really determine what roles you have and the talent you have available, how that talent really aligns to the jobs that you are going to have open, what skill sets that person has and which skill sets they don't to meet those requirements, and then creating a dedicated development and learning journey for that person. I'll talk a lot about this. It's something that we feel passionate working for a learning technologies group, that learning and investment within your employee base solves a lot of these strengths that we're going to see today. And the last one is kind of hiring for the skill you need rather than the formalized job. So looking at the skills, understanding what are the basic requirements for the role, and removing any type of arbitrary barriers. So if a degree is not necessarily required, if that person has the amount of experience, is going to open up a much broader range of talent that is consistently overlooked. And it also decreases biases within hiring practices, to make a more playing field for people who may not have had the higher opportunities for higher education or qualifications, but still have the required experience. So that's kind of what we've seen be adopted across our client bases and our partner client bases, as different ways to source in a tight labor market. So that takes us to our first poll. Throughout the webinar, I'm going to have a couple of different questions that I want to ask you guys, and then make sure you're putting in your questions that you want to ask me. But for the first one of the polls, which of these strategies have helped you the most of the ones that we talked about to kind of mitigate the lack of talent available? Have you guys kind of taken on any of these strategies previously, whether that's the talent pools and pipelines, referral programs, doing an analysis of your rates and adjusting your compensation strategy, internal investment, internal mobility, or redefining your roles and qualifications? Or maybe you're doing something else. So I'll give you a couple more seconds to kind of go through and complete the first poll. So it looks like the results are coming in. It's kind of going up and down. Cool. It says it's pretty across the board, so that's interesting. But it seems like the most commonly completed are the talent pools and pipelines, followed very closely by and now tied with the referral programs. So that's very interesting. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is the trends, would be the increased use of technology. So I think regardless of what industry we're in, we're experiencing new software and new technology all of the time. I would say in like the past, even 2 months, I've had 3 different companies that I am a customer for say, hold on, I'm like learning a new technology, give me a second. Whether that's your doctor's office, I think mine was personally scheduling a haircut online and then trying to get my dogs into daycare. We're seeing new technology pop up everywhere. More specifically, kind of looking at what we've kind of adopted over the last years. Again, it's not a new topic, but I think being forced to work differently has made us try to find the best ways to be more efficient. So we've been forced to work in new ways with COVID, and we have to figure out on the fly, how are we going to be our most efficient selves? We've seen a lot of technology adoption. Gartner said that 16% of employers added more tech to monitor employee activity. I think we've all had the battle with the love-hate relationship between our communication and meeting tools, where we thought our virtual happy hours were super fun to begin with. And then finding new ways to engage with our teams and with these platforms over the pandemic has been fun. I think our company did a fun Cinco de Mayo lunch today, which was a great use of our new technology. But we've also seen technology advancements that have made our lives easier, whether that's virtual appointments, more e-commerce sites for places that were typically all shopping in person, as well as maybe like restaurants developing apps that didn't have them before. But we wanted to talk about specifically to the human capital space, what we've seen be beneficial technology implemented for our customers and partners when it comes to workforce management. So looking at technologies that were adopted to drive efficiency, the basics, the applicant tracking systems to automate the sourcing of full-time employees. We've specifically provide vendor management, and we've seen an increase in the adoption of vendor management to really get the insight of the total workforce, understanding what contractors you have on site, and driving efficiency in the process of sourcing, managing, and offboarding that talent. Specifically within the mid-market, we've seen an increased usage of vendor management tools for kind of the mid-market organizations that might not have had them in place before. And this coincides with the findings of staffing industry analysts who also saw the greatest number of adopters of vendor management licenses in the past year be in that mid-market category. Other areas we've seen increases in technology is shift scheduling. We've seen a higher adoption across full-time and the contingent workforce, integrating together into shift scheduling tools. So making it easier to understand what shifts you have open, who's filling those shifts, who needed to drop a shift, making it easier for workers to swap shifts amongst each other. It's very hard to predict when you're going to get sick, especially with having the pandemic. It made it a lot easier for communication across employees to pick up drop shifts within the shift scheduling tool, with the built-in logic of the organization to make sure too many shifts aren't being picked up. We've seen this a lot. I'm seeing a lot of shift scheduling introduced, especially in the contingent space with healthcare. We've seen it added in light industrial, retail, hospitality as a result of the pandemic. As I mentioned, and as you guys have somewhat implemented yourself based off of the poll results, we've seen an increase in the use of talent pooling as a necessity to find talent and fill different positions, and to couple that with direct sourcing specifically for the contingent space, where as contingent labor need increases, having different avenues to procure the talent. So putting your contingent jobs on your full-time sites through your job boards, and then bringing in the labor at a decreased cost. So we've seen a lot more direct sourcing implemented in the past year, as well as talent pooling across the entire workforce. Internal mobility. So working with employees to really understand their aspirations, their goals, where they want to move within your organization, and then having dedicated technology to help that come to fruition. So providing them in the tool a place to kind of indicate their interests, where they want to grow, and then assigning learning to that skill, or whether it's a hard skill or soft skill, to help them develop, as well as assigning projects that they might better associate or help their skill set grow within the organization, and mentors that can help them grow to that opportunity. So we've seen more internal mobility tools introduced, as well as learning, kind of the similar thought. A lot of them are implemented together or just putting learning in place as a motivator for employees, as well as facilities management. So kind of determining who's going to be in the office when, maybe moving away from dedicated cubicles or offices to hoteling within a facilities management tool, so that you can go in, pick your desk, hook up your cords, and be able to work from any spot within the office, as well as just managing COVID compliance, if that's something your organization is doing. So these are the top kind of technologies we've seen across our clients and our partners, being introduced in the past year to help manage and drive efficiency. And as I mentioned, these are all trends that I see today and during the pandemic that I don't think will be going away. And that kind of takes us to our second poll to kind of understand which technologies have you adopted, or are you considering in the near term? Are you looking at applicant tracking systems, vendor management tools, scheduling softwares, direct sourcing and on-demand staffing, learning development, and internal mobility? So just trying to gauge kind of where are you putting your thoughts of technological advancement in the next year or so, or you've considered in the past year. So I'll give some time to kind of collect your feedback there. So I see a lot in the applicant tracking. Everything seems pretty similar. Learning development, that's good. It's actually really nice to see. I feel like that's something that's kind of underserved in the space, and internal mobility as well. So it's great to see that that's a high priority for a lot of you guys. Great, that's great feedback. Awesome. All right, this is really useful information. Thank you. And then the next one I want to talk about, our third trend for today, is kind of the humanization of the workforce. So we have our tech in place. That was our second trend. Now let's look at our next trend of the humanization of the workforce. I think the pandemic was very eye-opening for many people. It really kind of emphasized the point that employees are humans that have more than physical needs. And I think that was a concept that was kind of surfacing pre-pandemic, but I think being in a situation that was as mentally taxing as a global pandemic, coupled with working from home and being almost even closer to the workforce, it really highlighted the importance of psychological safety in the workplace, emotional intelligence, as well as mental well-being, and the importance of that. And I will say, kind of looking at the different data and doing the research, it kind of seems as though fairness is a huge topic, and the fairness is a huge part of feeling valued in the workforce. So I wanted to do kind of a portion of this trend and talk about what fairness is and how it's perceived by employees. So looking at some data that was collected by Gartner, they found that only 18% of employees feel like they have a fair place to work. And that kind of aligned with HR's opinion as well. 22% of the HR programs that were surveyed say that their place is a fair place to work. But I feel like fair is a very broad topic. So what does it mean to have a fair workforce, to really treat your employees to where they feel like they have a fair place to work? So the three components I'm going to talk about are the transparency. So only 33% of the employees surveyed said their companies have true information transparency. And that was a very important thing to them. So being able to share information in a way that is proportional to everyone around compensation, around recruiting practices, around the performance of the organization in general, is a way that they will feel that their organization is more fair. The next is feeling supported. So I feel like support in that sense is, do they feel supported at work? Do they feel valued? And do they feel like all components of safety are considered? And that caused an increase in well-being programs up 64% by wanting to make employees feel more supported. And the last consideration, or the last component of fairness, is consideration. when they were looking at the data, it said that only 18% of qualified employees were considered for advancement. So that would mean that there's positions open that qualified current employees weren't considered for. And I don't think any of that was done maliciously. I think that we have referral programs in place. As I mentioned, we've seen that implemented across the board in a variety of different organizations. So there's kind of that formalization of the referral process for talent that's outside of your existing workforce. But I think where there can be an improvement is having a formalized process for referrals for that are internal to your organization for existing positions. I think when there's no formal process, it's kind of more of a hearsay, or it might fall on the line manager that might not necessarily know that that person is looking for advancement or a new opportunity. So again, that formalization around the internal process for employees to identify what their career aspirations are and then apply for different jobs that are posted internally. So making that potentially a step in the recruitment process. Maybe there's a period of time that is dedicated for internal employees to interview for positions before it's promoted on job boards or your career site to allow for that internal advancement, to kind of create that idea of organizational fairness. Another area where employees indicated that they would find higher satisfaction is with that professional development. So it was really great to see the polls come across. It looks like this is something that you guys are doing already. As I looked at kind of data from SHRM that said only about a third of employees are happy with the professional development that they're getting today. And 21% of employees are willing to leave for that reason alone if they feel like they're not getting that career and skill development to kind of help them with their career advancement. Not only is it great for the employee, it's great for you guys too, which is good because it keeps employees engaged and helps you create that talent pipeline to kind of help you build out that succession planning. And it does say employees with learning and career advancement opportunities are 15% more engaged with a 34% higher retention rate. So it is an investment. It is a lot of time and planning to kind of get that learning strategy and development plan in place. But looking at the data is well worth it, as well as it's really great for emotional and employee well-being. Another way to make your employees feel value is communicating their value to them. So understanding how they like to receive praise. Praise is important. I think sometimes we don't necessarily give the recognition as much as we need to, but also understanding how employees like to be recognized. I have employees within our organization that love like recognition in front of everybody, but I also know I have employees that if I were to say something to the entire team, they would be mortified. So really understanding how people really like to receive that praise and giving it on a more frequent cadence. And then valuing quality of work over quantity of work. I think there's a perception sometimes that the employee that's working like over 40 hours a week is your hardest working employee, whereas you have another employee that is very good at managing their time and puts out quality work within an allotted amount of time. So really removing that perception around the quality being less important than the quantity. Managing burnout. So I think that the pandemic has definitely added a lot of burnout by being in front of your screen all day. So kind of thinking of creative ways to manage burnout, whether that's from a tactical standpoint, helping to prioritize different amount of work, allowing for different mental health breaks. Something that our company is doing for right now, at least, is no meeting Friday. So that's really exciting to a lot of us to have a dedicated time to really work on our learning development plans or really sit down for a project that requires a lot of time with no interruptions. So really trying to manage that burnout and then providing flexibility and understanding. I will say this happened a lot when the pandemic first started, when people were having to play multiple roles of like teacher and doctor and really allowing for flexible shifts. And maybe people were working later at night and kind of not working as much during the day. But I think it's important to really look at the things that we did during the pandemic that worked and provide that flexibility, even as we're kind of hopefully, knock on wood, rounding the corner. So that's kind of what we're thinking about with the communicating value. On the note of flexibility, I do want to kind of hop into our next trend of workforce flexibility in general. So workforce flexibility, I really am going to break into kind of two different components of remote work. What is remote work? I think most of us understand that, but looking at the benefits and things we might not even have thought about as benefits of remote work, as well as what are the downsides, because I don't know if the downsides of remote work are always talked about, as a lot of candidates do prefer to work flexibly from their homes or in a hybrid method. And the second component of that, I want to talk about the increased use of the extended workforce or the flexible workforce as it relates to the pandemic. So I'm going to kind of break this section into two here. So the first part talking about, the remote work, I think we've all adjusted to remote work one way or another. You either love it, hate it, might be somewhere in between. I personally enjoy it, but I know other people in my organization who don't like it at all. So I think we all have our personal opinions on it, but I did want to talk about both sides of working remotely. Obviously, for some, there are fewer distractions. I think it really depends on how you're set up. If you have the luxury of a dedicated space or dedicated office to kind of work in, you have fewer distractions, as well as you might experience greater productivity in that way. More personal time, eliminating the time in the car driving. Your work kind of starts at a specific time and ends at a more specific time. So there's no like packing up your things, walking to the car, or if you're using public transportation, waiting for the bus, all of that, you get kind of that time back in the day as well as I think we've all done it at some point, whereas you have 5 minutes between a meeting here and there. So you have those letting the dog out or, throwing the load of laundry in. So you get that time back kind of after work that you didn't really sacrifice during the day, if that makes sense. The decreased cost and stress of commuting. I personally hate driving. So not having to spend the time in the car, clutching the steering wheel. So if any of you live in Raleigh, it's just not a good experience, as well as less gas and maintenance. And then I think most of us kind of understood those, but allowing for comfort in the workplace. And I'm not just talking about like pajamas with your Zoom shirt or working on the couch. I think it's introduced ways for people to communicate in a way that makes most comfort and most sense to them. So it's not all relying on face-to-face communication or email. There's been so many different ways to communicate that have been introduced from working at home. I think it allows people to have more ideas, more creativity, and express them in a way that's more comfortable to them, as well as it allows people to bring out their true and authentic self, specifically with minority populations. I was reading more about this, about how there's less of a sense of microaggressions or feeling like you have to act a certain way, as well as increased, some of the data showed that there's a 50% increase in the sense of belonging with minority groups by having worked at home. So there's just a better overall feeling and making the workforce a comfortable or more comfortable place for everyone to be. So that kind of highlights the benefits, the enjoyable parts of remote working. I do want to talk about the flip side of remote work, things that I don't know that we talk about all too often. I think it can be hard to build a team culture. I think it can be difficult to connect when you're not in person, or you can't have those ad hoc conversations, or you're not in the break room talking about personal ideas, or it's just a lot harder to facilitate that team culture when you're not in person. So I don't think that that's going to go away anytime soon. So it's thinking of creative ways to build that team culture while being remote. And I think this does lead to a higher level of turnover in remote positions. So that was kind of the data I was finding, that the remote positions kind of lead to a higher level of turnover if there is no interaction kind of in person. Like I said, it's harder to build that culture, as well as there's less of kind of a social, not responsibility, but kind of like joining factor of having that social relationship with your employees. So it's easier to kind of terminate and move to a different role. One of the most concerning parts about remote work is bias in hiring practice and kind of preconceived ideas about remote workers versus in-office workers. In a survey Gartner did to over 1,000 managers, the managers perceived that 64% of the in-office workers were higher performers, and they would be 72% more likely to be promoted. So there's kind of this perceived idea of which kind of group is a better performer, as well as I think that perpetuates biases and kind of creates further gaps, because it was found that women and minority groups kind of tend to work at home more and prefer to work at home. So I think that's something that we really need to keep in mind when looking at remote work and removing those hopefully unconscious biases when it comes to hiring practices. I think we do all enjoy being able to hire in a broader network, not being stuck hiring in one location. But I think that the flip side of that is without the right processes or without the right processes defined, you can have disjointed or negative onboarding experiences. And that's kind of the first interaction that your worker gets of your organization. So making sure you have a solid onboarding experience for remote workers, as well as making sure that no one ever feels isolated, especially if you do have groups that are more concentrated in areas than others. So the people that are in the areas that maybe don't have a coworker that are also in that region to kind of communicate or join up with, making sure that they don't feel isolated because of the remote work. And then again, the burnout. So just making sure you're managing burnout, because not everyone does have a designated space, or I think we've all had that day where we've been in back-to-back Zoom meetings and it can be a lot. So just make sure you have a process and plan in place to manage and check in with your workers to ensure they're not feeling that burnout in their home offices. So that kind of highlights the flexibility in where and how we work. The next thing I want to talk about when we're talking about flexible work arrangements is the increased use of the flexible workforce. So looking at that, I would say flexible workforce, contingent workforce, it's not new. It's something that's been around for a long time. It's something that's been growing for a long time. But with the pandemic, while it initially dropped dramatically, there's a high increase in the use of contingent labor. This kind of mimics the same thing that happened after the Great Recession in 2008, where initially everybody kind of laid off their contingent workforce because I think there's a psychological component of them not being as close and they're not having to lay off full time, but then staffing back up with that safety net of contingent work is more temporary and easier to scale up and down with. So we are seeing an increase in the amount of contingent labor usage. Looking at the Gartner survey, that 32% of full-time positions are being replaced with contingent positions. There's a record amount of self-employment due to priority changes. Some of this was involuntary due to the pandemic that's been carried through, and some of it's more entrepreneurial or people wanting to work for themselves. There's definitely been an increase in the use of the labor, and reasons we're hearing for the increased uses, again, the idea of rebuilding with temporary labor to kind of try out a position before they bring it on full time. It reduces operating costs, easier to source, and then kind of the not having to pay full benefits that typically comes through the vendor. And then supplementing the hard to find role. So while it is hard to find talent, some people are looking to that contingent network to kind of try to find talent in that talent pool as well. And then a need for, or the realization that some things are more project-based work. So instead of hiring a full person to work for the organization, looking more at the contract staff to kind of fill in those gaps and do that project or have a set amount of time to complete that project. So that's some of the reasons we're seeing the increased use in flexible workforce. So again, to reiterate, we've seen flexibility in how and when and where people work, as well as the type of contract arrangement, whether it's full-time, whether it's contingent, whether it's independent contractors. We've seen a lot more flexibility within the workforce that I don't think will be going away anytime soon. So that kind of takes us through the 4 different trends that we have. Just kind of wanted to put a highlight slide together here so that you guys have it as a takeaway. The 4 trends that we, again, existed pre-pandemic, but were definitely accelerated during the pandemic and we don't think are going away anytime soon, are the employee-led organizations. With the Great Resignation giving the power to the employee, it makes it difficult to find talent. So you need to come up with creative sourcing and retention strategies to keep talent on board, while leveraging internal resources, and all of these kind of trends have a learning component as well. So again, very happy to see that in the polls. Increasing that tech adoption with your recruitments, position or industry specific things like shift scheduling or talent pooling, as well as having that strong learning component. The humanization of the workforce, putting in well-being programs, communicating praise, understanding the value of work, managing burnout, having a strategy to address fairness within the organization, as well as the increased flexible work, understanding both sides of remote work, allowing for flexible schedules, and then increased use of contingent labor to rebuild or reach different types of talent or reach more talent when looking at different roles. So those were our 4 different trends that we feel are here to stay. I think we have one more poll here for you guys about would you like one of the members on our team to reach out to you further, whether it's to talk about one of these 4 different categories and how our clients are managing to them. So I'll just give you a second there. And please feel free to ask any questions. I'm excited to field your questions today. As you guys complete this last poll, we'll kind of move on to the question section of the webinar. So hopefully you guys got something out of it and have some good questions to ask. Megan, do we have anybody coming through with some good questions?
We have a couple of good ones in the chat box here. The first one I want to toss out to you, Taylor, is what do you think drove the spark for self-incorporation over the past year?
Yeah, I think it was at first a necessity, kind of maybe being removed from the workforce involuntarily and then having to kind of find out what you want to do next, kind of picking up more gig roles or shift roles outside of what the typical work was. I also think that it gave, again, as I mentioned, like this self-evaluation, people with more entrepreneurial spirits, kind of self-incorporating and kind of moving forward with journeys that they had seen for themselves and are ready to take that risk and take that on as well. I'd also say generational shifts. So I think there's different generations prefer to work differently. I will say that the millennials, Gen Z, more interested in working for themselves, and that could lead to the self-incorporation there, as well as the rise in the freelance community.
Wonderful. And as we start to think about that idea of, culture is really shifting, we've got a great question here. How does the company build better team culture when everybody's working remotely? What are some ideas that can be implemented at the company that all employees actually want?
It's a really good question. I think that what I would recommend and what we're trying to do at our organization as well to get everybody involved is like soliciting feedback. I think sometimes people get stuck at the highest level, at the management level, to kind of be like, this is what our employees want, without really kind of going in, gathering feedback, like, how do you feel like we can best engage you? What kind of community groups do you want to be in? Maybe putting employee resource groups together. A learning technologies group has a lot of great employee resource groups, excuse me, to kind of create like diverse different pockets of people to kind of communicate together of what can like make the organization better from different perspectives. So I think putting together employee resource groups to understand different views, different perspectives, as well as really reaching out to your employees to understand, or maybe making it anonymous as well as what we do, as well as build out different pulse surveys. So understanding how you're feeling, it can anonymously respond about how you're feeling about different things we've implemented, where they hit, where they miss. So hopefully that helps and solves some or answers some of that question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Taylor. And it's a great segue to another piece. This last question we just talked about really is hitting on the human touch perspective, but we talked about combining automation with human touch. What are some of the best practices? What are some of the best case examples that you've seen? Where have you seen that done with excellence, Taylor?
Yeah. So one way I've seen it used is kind of implementing it within technology specifically. I do work on the technology side of things, so that's where my mind tends to go, is looking and implementing artificial intelligence to look at the success factors of the candidate to shortlist talent, but using the human touch to really go in and evaluate. Same could be done with like job recommendations. I think we've all gotten like job recommendations in our email to apply for that we might not necessarily have been qualified for. So doing that curation, really looking at who's applying for jobs, even though they might have been auto matched using automation and artificial intelligence, as well as shift matching, really looking at what the worker has picked up before or what jobs they picked up before, and recommending those as to different employees as well, or different people that are picking up in your shift management tool.
Absolutely, Taylor. And you make a great point, especially as you talk about some of those best practices, you're weaving them back into, that idea around talent acquisition, recruiting. Got another great question here asking, is it a shortage of labor or a shortage of recruiting talent? I think it's an interesting perspective. So what are your thoughts on that? Shortage of labor or shortage of recruiting talent, given that so many resumes are just not, so many applications are just not seeing the top of the pile?
Yeah, I definitely think it's recruiting talent. I think it's a variety of different factors, honestly. I saw a stat somewhere that was very interesting to me that I'm making up the number and I can find this stat, but it was like of the 11 million open positions, even if the 5 million people that are actively looking for talent apply, you're still going to have a large gap. And that might be exaggeration on the open jobs, but it was like millions of jobs that would still be open because there's such a mismatch on like the skills that are available and then the jobs that are open. And I think some of that stems from, again, that self-evaluation and finding the time to reskill and relearn and reprioritize what you want to do with your career. So people might have left the workforce with one job and used the pandemic as a time to reskill, learn a new skill, and then come back with a different job, as well as looking at the automation and people being filtered out or not considered, or not being considered for the wrong reasons, whether that's like there's a bachelor's degree required, but you have the relevant experience here, or you looked at it all like an alternative method of learning that's not necessarily qualified and you're being filtered out by automation.
I love the way you tackled that, Taylor, because really both in the answer to that question that came out of our audience, as well as in the way you approach this presentation, the answer here is it's really a multifactorial, a multidimensional approach to managing things here. So thank you so much for your very well-researched and interesting presentation. We were thrilled to have you here to enlighten us on some of the pandemic workforce trends that are here to stay. Just a reminder to HCI's members, today's webcast has been approved for both HRCI and SHRM credit, as well as for HCI recertification. Your credits for attending this webcast will soon show up in your My HCI portal underneath the transcript tab. And while you're there, don't forget to check out hci.org for even more insights, as well as information on our certifications, premium membership, and more. And I just want to say one more big thank you to Taylor and the team at Vector for joining us here today. Thank you so much, Taylor, for sharing your wisdom. We're so glad to have you with us at VectorVMS. And I'd also like to thank you, our webcast viewer. Thank you for spending an hour with us today. We'll see you all next time.